All right, welcome everybody. I'm Gavin Thornton, the Executive Director of Hawaiʻi Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice. Thank you so much for joining this conversation with United States Senator Brian Schatz. Senator Schatz has graciously agreed to talk with us today as part of an event series that Hawaiʻi Appleseed is holding, part of our annual Artists for Appleseed fundraiser. We're so grateful for the Senator to join us, especially now during this time of turmoil, all that's happening in our nation, the Supreme Court nomination, Hawaii opening the state up to out-of-state travel, the looming election, mounting racial tensions, the continued pandemic and fears of recession. You know, it all feels very intense, to say the least, that this is a critical juncture in our history, where much is at stake. You know, we were contemplating most, not all of these things when we asked Senator Schatz to join us for this event. Just thinking about how he would have important insights into the circumstances that we're facing. But I've got to confess, you know, we were considering an alternative given the overwhelming feelings that people are having now. Thinking hard about asking Bob Ross maybe to paint some little happy trees for us. A group meditation session, but that just was not workable, unfortunately. But actually, fortunately, just absolutely thrilled to have the Senator here. Very appreciative of this opportunity. Senator Schatz has been a strong voice for many of the issues that we at Hawaiʻi Appleseed care about and are working hard on here at home. For those of you that aren't familiar with Hawaiʻi Appleseed, just real briefly, we're a research and advocacy organization working to promote policy and systems change to help create a Hawaii where everyone can thrive. We focus on issues related to affordable housing, to food insecurity or hunger, and also tax and wage fairness issues. I don't want to spend really any more time talking about us. I do want to thank our sponsors for this event. I want to encourage folks to go to Appleseed.com, artistsforappleseed.com, to learn more about us, our sponsors, this event series. And please, if you're able to, make a donation to support this work. And then lastly, I also want to encourage folks in the Q&A box during the course of this conversation, please submit your questions. Some folks have already submitted questions beforehand, probably more than we can get to, unfortunately, but we'll do what we can to have a good variety of questions for folks. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Brian Schatz, Hawaii's senior United States Senator. He serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, the Indian Affairs Committee, and the Select Committee on Ethics. Senator Schatz also chairs the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis, strong advocate there, and serves on the Senate Democratic Caucus's leadership team as Chief Deputy Whip. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you. Thanks, Gavin, for having me. And I want to thank everybody for being on this call. I know it's a busy time and stressful time. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have an exchange of views. I thought I would go relatively quick so I could accommodate as many questions as possible. Let me start with where we are on COVID relief. The very high likelihood is that it's going to have to wait until after the election. That is deeply unfortunate. I think state and county governments are going to have to make some incredibly difficult decisions. I've been in contact with legislative leaders locally. They do think they have several months more runway before the most draconian of measures would have to be undertaken, but you know, they do not have endless cash reserves. So that continue in terms of legislation to pass in the short run, that continues to be my very highest priority. The Senate is occupied with the Supreme Court nomination. I don't think I have anything necessarily to add to that other than the following observation, which is that Mitch McConnell uses power maximally every single time. And that is pretty customary for most legislative bodies, but the United States Senate was characterized over, say, 3 or 4 decades by restraint that was supposed to be maintained via comity, via personal relationships and respect for the institutions, the processes, the customs and practices, the tradition of the Senate itself. I believe that Mr. McConnell has broken all of those norms. He hasn't broken the law in this case, but he has broken all of those norms to the point where if and when the Democrats take the Senate back, we should be restrained by ethics. We should be restrained by the law. We should be restrained by the voters, but we should not be restrained by some sense that we have to behave as if it is the 1975 Senate and Mitch McConnell gets to operate in the 2020 Senate. Because everything that Mitch McConnell wants to do, he already has the votes for when he's in a majority. Supreme Court justices and tax cuts, that's the main thing. And those require a 51 vote bare majority. A lot of our priorities at the current moment require a 60 vote threshold. So just something to think about. I want to give you something that I'm super hopeful about, and that is our potential for taking action on the climate crisis. And the reason that I'm hopeful is that the coalition building that was necessary to get climate action just hadn't been done in the past. There were really smart policies and really smart people and good people who advocated either for a carbon fee or a a cap and trade, but we hadn't done the work. We hadn't built the multicultural, geographically diverse, politically diverse coalition necessary to actually get this thing done. And combining Joe Biden's efforts with the Senate Committee on the Climate Crisis efforts, we now have a proposal and a plan, not reduced exactly to legislative text yet, but an approach that is and this is the main thing, sufficient to the task, big enough to make the necessary difference to begin to solve this planetary crisis, but maybe as essentially, we've actually done our politics. We have, my first phone call when I became the chairman of the Special Committee on the Climate Crisis was to the head of the National AFL-CIO and said, can we start over? Can we think about how to turn climate action into an economic opportunity for your members? My next phone call was to my staff to reach out to Native communities, American Indian tribes, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian organizations, to tell us what they already know about how to manage natural resources. And then we went to mayors, and then we went to the private sector, and so on and so forth. And now we have a coalition that I think is in a position to actually make meaningful change. I want to just touch upon one local issue that I've been working with Appleseed on, and that was sort of interrupted by COVID and the truncation of the legislative session, and that is housing. I've done a bill called the YIMBY bill in the United States Senate with Todd Young, who happens to be a Republican who runs the National Republican Senate Committee. So there's an opportunity to do some meaningful work on housing. But I think if I may draw a quick parallel between what we did to stitch together the coalition that puts us in a position to win on climate, I think we have to do some of that work on housing and on, generally speaking, the cost of living locally. We really sort of have a balkanization among progressives who advocate for certain priorities. And we haven't had that, what they call on the mainland, intersectional conversation where we understand that housing is a climate issue, right? And that climate is a justice issue, right? And that education is a healthcare issue. And that certainly racism is a health disparity driver. And we haven't done enough of that locally, partly because Democrats run things, so we're busy fighting with each other about all these things for primacy in terms of what position someone as the most progressive or the most effective. But I do think that one of the things that Appleseed does very effectively, and something that I want to help with, is to try to stitch together these coalitions so that they make sense, so that we're not fighting between people who care about economic development and people who care about climate, or people who care about housing and people who care about healthcare. All of these issues really are linked, and the politics has to reflect that. And I think we are a little bit behind on doing the hard work of talking to each other, listening to each other, and building the kinds of coalitions that can sort of continue Hawaii in its grand tradition of leading on progressive change. Frankly, it's been a while since we've done it. My own judgment is the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative was the last big progressive thing the Hawaii political system has done that makes it a model for the world. And before that, it was the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and reproductive choice and support for collective bargaining. But I just want us to think in terms of what's happening on the mainland, that there's a lot on the mainland that we don't want to copy. But one thing that's happening in progressive circles that is very exciting to me is the idea that among progressives, we're realizing that each against all is not going to work, and that we've got to sort of stand together in solidarity. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, you actually already started. I don't think you know, but someone in the question box said, what's being done about climate change and global warming in the Senate, which you responded to. What can people do to help? Was a follow-up question there.
Well, I'm on a government computer right now, so I'm not going to refer to any elections. But there are, I can just say there are elections coming up and they're important. One thing I will say that is a non-electioneering thing that people can do if they're kind of worried about the sanctity of the vote is you can go to wetheaction.org, and they are taking people to be on a phone bank. You can do it from anywhere to help people to understand their rights and specifically cure their ballots. There are a bunch of states in which if you have some sort of idiosyncratic, non-compliant aspect of your ballot, you get 24 hours to cure it. And so you need what has been characterized to me by Mark Elias, this sort of super lawyer who works on these ballot access and ballot justice issues, a bottomless need for volunteers. So all you have to do is go to wetheaction.org, and it's like a 1.5 hour training. And then you can just sort of, instead of just constantly refreshing your laptop or your phone, freaking out about the election, you can at least be available if anybody needs assistance in making sure their ballot is lawfully counted.
Great, thank you. I threw that link in the chat.
Yeah, someone put the link on it. Technology is great.
I'm probably messing it up, but it seems to be going all right. So you were talking about one of the current issues that you're working on, when you were speaking about Mitch McConnell's approach, the Supreme Court nomination. Could you share with us some of the insights that you have on the nomination?
Well, I think Amy Coney Barrett is going to be confirmed. We're going to do everything we can to get in the way of that. But sort of the way the Senate rules work is that you can change any set. So there are Senate procedures that allow us to delay things, but any Senate procedure can be changed with a 51 vote margin. So if we get in the way of it, and we will, then Mitch McConnell will literally change the rules on a rolling basis and just and run over us eventually. We'll fight like hell, but I just want everybody to understand that the fundamental problem right now is that we don't control the United States Senate confirmation process. And I think the one thing that I'll observe is that even in my relatively short time, 7.5 years or so in the US Senate, the extent to which the courts are paid attention to by people on both sides of the aisle has gone up. It used to be primarily conservatives worried about the courts and progressives worried about other stuff. But the fact that Roe is very much on the chopping block, the fact that the Affordable Care Act could be blown up starting November 10th is making all of this very real for people. But I just I think all of the members of judiciary are doing a capable job, but they have the votes, and there's not a single person whose mind is being changed by these hearings.
Upcoming elections, very much on everybody's mind. What do you foresee there in terms of, I guess, legislation that you'd hope to pass if Democrats were successful in taking the majority in the Senate? What would your priorities be?
So for me, it's climate action. I mean, this is my it's not the only thing I care about, but it's certainly my longest held highest priority. And I think this will be our best opportunity to do something. I've also observed that Joe Biden's climate plan is massive, and and Andrew Yang, who I don't always agree with, but he said something I thought that was a real insight about Joe Biden. He's got this Midas effect where if it's proposed by Joe Biden, people immediately assume it is reasonable. And so if I proposed a climate plan as aggressive as Joe's, it would be assumed to be like an opening offer, right? But since Joe Biden's saying it, everyone's like, yeah, we should probably do that. That makes sense. It'll help auto manufacturing, and that's great. And I mean, I talked to Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, my good friend, and I'm not one of those senators who says, oh, he's my friend. Sherrod is a personal friend, just a good guy, and he talked about FDR and other consequential presidents who were pushed into being into historic presidencies, who were, creatures of the Senate, who were creatures of the establishment, who, when they ended up in the presidency, that the moment itself caused them to oversee a period of transformational change. And I think we have that opportunity with Joe Biden. And I think the work that he did, Ezra Klein from Vox observed this too, that one of his skills is such a old Paul skill, which is, you're presiding over a committee, the different interest groups or whatever disagree with each other. And then you say well, why don't we just set up a process and see if we can forge a consensus, right? And that's such old school politics. It's not Twitter, it's not online fundraising, it's not performing, with a snappy thing in a debate. It's just old school coalition building. And what he did after he sort of cinched up the primary was he had a long conversation with Bernie Sanders. He invited Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into the fold. And then just as for example, they've got Stephanie Kelton on monetary theory. They've got some very interesting thinkers on climate. And you've got some of the, the old bulls, Ron Klain, John Kerry, these kind of old-time Biden hands, but also a bunch of people of color, women, indigenous folks who are populating their inner circle in such a way that now we have, I think, a growing coalition. So it's very exciting, and I'm pretty hopeful. I'll just make one further observation, which is the normal assumption, even among progressives, is when you take the Senate, you can only do one or two things, right? I mean, I remember the old story, which has been often repeated. Rahm Emanuel, goes to Obama and says, you can only do a couple of things, and if you do healthcare, you're not going to be able to do these other things. I just think we have to reject the premise that we can only do a couple of things, because of how much damage has been done in a short period of time, and because of how much easier it is to break something than to build something, that we can't allow Trump to have destroyed American institutions and American small businesses and other things across the country, and then move at the pace of the 1978 Senate to try to fix it, because that'll be 30 years before we get it all done. So for me, it's climate and COVID relief, but I actually think we're going to need to do 8 to 10 big things in the first year. We're going to need to do economic relief. We're going to need to do democracy reform. We're going to need to do policing and justice reform. We're going to need to do something on immigration, on climate, on public education, on healthcare more generally. We cannot afford, our country cannot afford to watch us take our leisurely senatorial time getting all of this stuff done. And so I'm arguing even internally that we shouldn't operate on the premise that we've got to prioritize. Sure, one thing has to come first, but the point is we actually have to do all of these things in order to save the republic.
Well, one of those things that you mentioned, democracy reform. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what are the big threats, opportunities to our democracy that you're seeing? What kinds of reforms should we be pursuing if given the opportunity?
I would start with the Voting Rights Act. I would continue with gerrymandering reform. A lot of what's in H.R. 1, which passed the U.S. House, I think, as the first bill that they passed when they took power, is great stuff. The one thing I would add, and I actually think there's an opportunity for bipartisanship in this space, is a lot of the everybody understands this. Our constitutional structure assumes a very powerful chief executive and gives her or him extraordinary authorities. And then the jurisprudence has added to that, and on the basis that the check is impeachment, right? Now that we know that if the impeachment threshold is 67 and you've got polarization and probably asymmetric polarization, that impeachment may not be off the table, but it's going to be even more extraordinary than it was envisioned to be, that now we may want to have some statutory constraints on the use of presidential power, because a lot of our assumptions about the use of presidential power were based on norms and expectations and the willingness of the legislative branch to assert itself in oversight, to retaliate using the appropriations process. And to the extent that we've abdicated all of those roles, you get this increasingly powerful executive that should appeal to some Republicans, right? And I remember walking up to some Republican senators after the president was voted not guilty by the United States Senate, and I just said, whatever caused you to arrive at that conclusion, please do not adopt the Alan Dershowitz, theory of the case, which is that anything that the president does, if the president believes it is in the best interest of the country, it is by definition not subject to impeachment and removal. And they said, oh, no, of course not. But I think there were a bunch of people who were sort of attracted to that kind of unitary executive authoritarian view of a kind of kingly president. But if there's a Democratic president, they will snap right back and assert their prerogatives as members of the legislative branch. But that's something that's important to me. And I do think we've just got to, go through, scrub the statutes for opportunities for, misfeasance and malfeasance.
You mentioned, some potential for bipartisan work. If Biden were to win the election, do you see that as fostering more bipartisanship, or do you feel like the divide will continue to grow?
Yeah, I think, look, Joe Biden is hard to get angry about, right? And I think one of the challenges in the primary, right, was, is he enough to get excited about, right? But I think that's two sides of the same coin. And I do think that it's going to be kind of difficult for them to demonize him. That doesn't mean Mitch McConnell doesn't care. He will present himself as a maximum obstacle to all progress. And we just have to bake that into the cake. And I know that probably sounds, even among Democrats, like a maybe overly partisan statement, but it's just how he operates. And what I have noticed is that the moments where we've had bipartisan success as a Senate have only been preceded by Democrats showing our unity and our willingness to push back. McConnell only understands procedural and political violence, right? He only respects procedural and political violence. Asking him nicely just doesn't work. On the other hand, if you show him that he will fail without you, then he'll cut the deal, right? And so it's a little counterintuitive, but I think it's a lesson that President Obama actually learned after maybe the third year or so, which is extending a hand to these people is not the way to get bipartisanship. Actually, it's showing that you're willing to move without them, and then they want to get in on the conversation. And I do think that on housing, on infrastructure, on COVID relief, even on healthcare, and potentially on climate with a few members, there's opportunity for bipartisanship. I just think we shouldn't engage in magical thinking and have the saving of the republic and the rescuing of the planet from this crisis contingent on, whether, I don't know, Rob Portman comes around, right? I mean, maybe he will, and that would be neat. But I think we got to get 51 ourselves.
On the COVID relief, any prospects for, this is a question from a viewer right now, any prospects for further COVID economic relief before the election? Predictions keep changing there.
I'd say it's pretty close to zero before the election.
Really?
Yeah. It's just the way the Senate calendar works. At this point, if the way the rules work is it's one thing at a time, one bill at a time or measure at a time. So you can either do the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett or COVID relief. And so it would require McConnell to decide to delay the Supreme Court justice until after the election. And that's only at the back end. That's assuming there was a deal, which there is not. So I am not terribly hopeful about the prospects in the next 3 weeks, which is, I'm here in Hawaii right now, and I understand sort of how much pain that's causing.
And does that include extension of the CARES Act relief? There's that December 31st or 30th deadline for using.
Well, yeah, I mean, as a practical matter, it includes everything, right? But there's a bunch of bills that we have to pass by the end of the year. So those kinds of technical issues can be handled when we deal with appropriations in the second week in December. And if I had to guess, that would be the best next opportunity for a COVID package. Flexibilities on CARES Act money, both in terms of timing and the use of it, and then maybe some additional resources as well.
Any thoughts on the differences between what a relief package might look like, just depending on how the elections go?
It is really hard to game out because a lot of that will depend on the president, the current president, because he's still president until inauguration. So if he loses, I think all bets are off. It's hard for me to imagine him participating constructively in a negotiation if he's a one-term president in the lame duck. So I have to say that worries me a little bit. Not only that, but the government funding bill expires on December 13th, and that could also be. He could muck with that because I think the likelihood that he becomes self-destructive, in the extreme after having lost is pretty high. Sorry.
Yeah, we should have invited Bob Ross, perhaps. Yeah. Any other thoughts, or what if it goes the other way?
I don't know then. It's my guess is then we'd be able to do a deal because, the Democrats have been wanting to do a COVID relief package since May, and we've been wanting to spend more. And, lots of folks were sort of wondering why we were arguing against interests, right? Political, electoral interests, that we were going to pump a bunch of money, borrowed money into the United States economy in the last 2 months before an election. And there were people who, and basically the reason that we were doing that is because we can't help ourselves, because we're Democrats and we actually care. That's literally why. And so my sense is, as soon as the Republicans are ready to make a deal, we'll make one.
Let me see here. You were extensively quoted in a Civil Beat article, maybe back end of August, about Hawaii's response to the pandemic. Just wondering if you could share your current insights on, what has Hawaii done well? What can we improve on regarding our COVID response here?
Yeah, I think it's improved. I think that Libby Char is doing a great job. I think we're a little less dysfunctional among major politicians. Like, there are still disagreements, but it doesn't look as nutty and confusing. I think the communication with the public has been a little more clear and crisp. But that's not just a sort of a comms issue. That's like, the reason we sounded unclear is because we were unclear, right? It wasn't like you could just get a PR firm to make it sound clear when we were in fact sort of adrift for a couple of months. The contact tracing capacity is higher. I feel like, at least anecdotally, mask wearing seems to be going up. Couple of observations. One is that I continue to think we are fixated on the airport as if it is the primary vector for the spread of the disease, and it just isn't. Like, even when we were arguing over the quarantine, even before the 14-day quarantine came into place, like, the disease is spreading among us because of us, not because of tourists. And that has to do with the fact that the truth is, we don't actually, most of us, even people who work in hospitality, are not having prolonged close contact with tourists. And tourists, especially now, are not going to be in like large, unsafe, prolonged close contact gatherings. And so, and the reason I think this is an important point to make, I'm not schlepping for the industry, is that we got so fixated on that, and the daily news about, who was a scofflaw, some guy from Oregon, runs away from the quarantine, and isn't he a jerk? And that became the focus, is that we forgot about how to actually stop the spread of this disease within our community. And it is universal mask wearing, keeping your distance. Social distancing sounds like a technical term. It's just staying away from each other physically. And now we know ventilation, right? Keeping doors and windows open where possible, and making sure you don't have long-term prolonged close contact. And so we sort of thought that we were safe because we had this 14-day quarantine. We weren't letting the disease come from elsewhere to us. And then it turned out that some of the places we weren't allowing people to land from had way less disease prevalence than us, right? New York City is a good example at this point. Lots of cities are a good example at this point. So I'm not saying that when schools open, that's not a new risk vector. I'm not saying that when tourism reopens with the PCR test, that's not a new. Everything is, to the extent that we have more and more people moving around and doing things, that increases the risk. But the main risk is clusters, right? The main risk is OCCC and housing projects and nursing homes and vulnerable communities. And we really need to attack those problems and not be fixated exclusively on sort of border control, because frankly, that's what Trump did with the travel bans. But the interesting thing was, he gave everybody like a 2-week runway. So 50,000 people from China, expats, flew in with no test because they realized this is going to be the last moment I can get home. I better get home. So you had this influx of people who actually brought disease. And so I just, sorry for getting on my soapbox about this particular problem, but community leaders really need to focus on clusters and how to reduce them. And yes, we need to do everything we can on testing people who are coming in, but the disease prevalence of a 737 if everyone's got a negative PCR test, is going to be lower than your Safeway. I mean, literally. So we just need to understand that we still need to behave as if as we all have COVID and everyone around us has COVID. And that's the way to keep this thing manageable, not to have it go away, but to keep things manageable. And my highest priority is that the DOE stays open. I mean, I just think everything else is very important, but kids not getting educated is just a total moral and operational failure of state government. So we've got to keep our eye on that prize.
And to the extent that they're open now, or can you flesh that out a little more?
Well, they're opening, and one of the things that sort of didn't get reported, but it was in the middle of this, what are we going to do about the airport thing, is that summer school happened, right? And it was, according to Superintendent Kishimoto, it was like the highest attendance summer, for understandable reasons, the highest attendance summer school that they've ever had. And there were just no clusters associated with summer school, right? And so there are certain things that we can do with safety precautions that we ought to do. And we've just got to attack this problem where it is most likely to occur, which at this point is not, public education, and not necessarily in a Waikiki hotel or the Kahala Hotel, which now has, pretty reasonable protocols in place.
One more pandemic-related question from the audience here. It seems too much of the CARES money ends up with wealthier people or business owners who don't need it. Are there better mechanisms to ensure future stimulus money gets to those who really need it?
Yeah, well, look, I think couple of observations. I used to be an anti-universal basic income person because I was introduced to the idea by a bunch of tech bros, and I didn't like it because it seemed to me that they were sort of dismantling the social safety net and then waving a wand called UBI, right? And in every instance, the UBI amount was never enough to like sustain a human being, right? However, and I still basically have that trepidation. I will say, however, that the $1,200 check was the first thing that arrived, and a lot of the rest of the money took forever for people. And so not means testing something and or maybe even just having it, a sort of simple adjusted gross income threshold. If you're below a certain threshold, you get the money. I sort of observe in personal terms, not me personally, but I observed people who were waiting on their UI but got their $1,200 stimulus check, and that actually did prevent them from being late on rent or mortgage or utilities. So that's that. On the unemployment insurance, there's just no doubt that the American economy, the Hawaii economy, would have absolutely collapsed worse than it did if we didn't have this enhanced unemployment insurance. And then on the PPP program, I guess my own judgment is that it was a little bit unnecessarily convoluted to have companies apply through a bank, go to SBA, SBA gives the money to the bank gives money to the company pushes it out through payroll. But that money was supposed to go to payroll. So I don't consider, even if it's a large corporation, if they're taking the money and pushing it out to their employees, that you could call that a subsidy to a big company, but it's also, helping to maintain everybody's basic needs. Really where the money went very much to Wall Street was on what the Federal Reserve was authorized to do. And some of those things were really necessary to stabilize markets, but some of them, because Mnuchin's in charge, were misused. And that was the difficulty, is that as we knew this was the result of a compromise in a divided government, that there were some $200 or $300 billion chunks that looked like they were going to go to the wealthiest corporations. And so if you want to kind of summarize, maybe it's not because of the CARES Act, but certainly in spite of the CARES Act, billionaires got much, much, much wealthier since this pandemic started. And so something is fundamentally rigged in the American economy, and that has to be fixed. I will say, I think that Biden being president and being able to run this or appoint people to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the other financial oversight regulators will go a long way towards righting those wrongs.
And that fundamentally rigged economy that you're talking about, I mean, does that really have anything to do with the CARES Act type relief, or is that just the way the economy was set up before? Do you have a sense of, what are some of the forces driving that?
I think it's a little bit of both. I will say though that this is my own observation, maybe other people disagree, but the CARES Act was a fundamentally progressive piece of legislation. Like, most of the money went to support people to not work, right? That we borrowed a bunch of money, we pushed trillions out to basically say the federal government cares about all of you staying afloat during this pandemic. And a couple of observations. We are in fact capable of doing big things in an emergency, right? Number two, borrowing a massive amount of money doesn't automatically trigger inflation and doesn't create unsustainable debt, right? And number three, those policies are broadly popular left, right, and center. You've got deficit scolds, and they exist. Even in the Democratic Party, they exist. But I thought the fact that if you sort of count up all the money in the CARES Act, that something around 80% of it went to people who were suffering, was already a progressive achievement.
I'm going to leave the pandemic behind. I wish we could, actually. Yeah. That would be really nice. Talk about a few other things, if you don't mind. One question that was submitted prior to this, do you see a path forward on addressing the needs of our Kofa migrants at the federal level?
Yeah, Maisie and I have been working on this. The short version of the situation is that when welfare reform was passed, a provision was snuck into the House version of the bill that provided that compact migrants, that services to provided to compact migrants under Medicaid were not reimbursable. And so anyone else goes into the hospital and gets services. If it's Medicaid or MedQuest, basically the state government's getting 50 cents on the dollar back from the federal government. That's just not the case for our Kofa brothers and sisters. And so that's the statutory fix, to make sure that the state government doesn't continue to have to pay 100% of that. But I think more broadly, and I'm interested in helping here. I don't necessarily have a sort of well-formed pathway, but I think we have to do better by this community. And there is a lot of racism towards this community in a kind of unusual way. Something that, I was here since I was 2, that I've never really observed. And so I think we really have to, when you talk about building coalitions, really make sure that Micronesians United and other organizations that work with these communities are elevated and treated as true partners. And it's important that Hawaii politicians give voice to these people, because that's what we do, right? And that we're all in this together. So yeah, there are a couple of statutory fixes. There's money stuff. There's there's renegotiating the compact. But to me, what's more important is attitudinally, do we all embrace the premise that these are our brothers and sisters too, and therefore they deserve to be organizationally elevated, not just sort of theoretically, oh yeah, we're for them, they're but really treated as equals in a progressive coalition.
Thank you. I'm going to throw in the chat here, organization in the Micronesian community, Kofa community, just a wonderful organization. Just want to give them a plug. We are Oceania. For
yeah.
folks that aren't familiar with these issues, great place to go to learn more. You know, they're doing a tremendous work, I think, mobilizing, helping their community, and great potential coalition partners to work on some of these issues. So, thank you. How do you feel about a rail question?
I mean, okay.
Can you comment about the status of federal funding for rail, given all the upheaval with the project, HART, et cetera?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not privy to the kind of, you know, I'm not any more privy than you are to the sort of status of the procurement, because the procurement law prevents me from knowing anything more than the average citizen. But I will just say that the FFGA remains in place. And I anticipate that once the state is in compliance with the FFGA, that the remaining $750 million will come. But that, I don't think it'll come before we're in compliance. And let me just be as crystal clear as possible. There is not more money from the federal government for the rail project. There is not some imaginary pot of money that I can go and grab as an earmark of $1 billion to make up our shortfall. That's not how this is going to work.
I haven't been sharing people's names, but I'm going to make an exception here. This is from Amy Grace, who I think you know. Hi, Senator. Speaking to another of your priorities, can you please discuss how you see your telehealth continuing in the future?
Oh, yeah. Well, so Dr. Amy Grace used to work for me. Now she works at UH. And a lot of the changes that, because of Amy and others, we made in the federal law before the pandemic have basically enabled people to get the care that they need under Medicare in particular, but also through ACOs. And, you know, we've gone from me talking about telehealth and everybody's like eyes glazing over to now everybody demanding more and more telehealth. And there are a couple of things in the early bills related to the pandemic that gave essentially some extreme flexibility to HHS to allow telehealth. And we just have to make all of those things permanent, because there's no going back. There's no reason to go back. I mean, look, there are procedures, there are reasons that you need to go into a doctor's office for observation. But some percentage, maybe 50, maybe 70% of what you do with your clinician can and should be done either telephonically or via video chat or with a device on your arm. Or, I mean, you know, because I grew up in Hawaii, I'm always taking pictures of, you know, freckles on my shoulder and trying to figure out if everything's cool. And now I just take a picture of my shoulder, I email it to my PCP, he emails it to dermatology, and then they tell me whether I got to come in for observation. And by the way, I confirmed that it wasn't just like some senator related special concierge service. They do this for anybody. They prefer doing it this way because they can knock this thing out really quickly and save everybody time. And in a COVID world, you also reduce the risk of exposure. So I'm thrilled with the work that we've done on telehealth. I continue to tell everybody it is absolutely bar none the most important thing that I've ever done that no one's heard about. Because it's transforming the way healthcare is delivered to make it cheaper, higher quality, and more accessible to everybody. The mental health opportunities in telehealth are great, partly because while some things, you know, don't lend themselves to telehealth, let's say surgery, mental health services via app or via video chat or even via text are actually better for a lot of people, because you can kind of circumvent the barriers related to stigma. So what we figured out with veterans in particular is VA is an unwelcoming environment for a lot of them. There's a lot of good care being given, but one of the things that when you're being evaluated as a provider of services is, do you provide a welcoming environment? Or when you walk, when you're a patient, do you walk in and does it seem intimidating and labyrinthine, and that you're not wanted, and that they're going to try to, make you feel like you're not eligible or whatever. And especially with mental health services with veterans, they get to skip all of that, get their eligibility determination, and then interact with a clinician sort of discreetly. And it changes everything in terms of the availability of mental health services. That's just one example, but dermatology, asthma, certainly specialty consultation, all of it, telestroke, it's really extraordinary work. And thank you to Amy for starting me off on this. And it's also an area of real bipartisan work. Every time I introduce a new telehealth bill, first of all, we've done it 2 or 3 times and they've all passed in some form or fashion. But also every time I do it, there's an equal number of Democrats and Republicans on the bill, because everybody wants cheaper and more available health care.
Any other kind of bright spots like that coming out of the pandemic? Is that too broad? I have a bunch of other questions.
Well, I guess the observation I'll make is that, and to me it relates specifically to the climate crisis, is that this is just a reminder that we can do big things if we are forced to, that the government is big enough, that we have a big enough balance sheet, that if we understand that something is an emergency, we're perfectly capable of acting. So it's not the fundamentals of our system that are broken. It's not that these are technical or policy challenges. It's our politics that are broken. And if we can fix our politics, we can move along on a lot of these policy areas.
I think we probably just have time for a couple more questions. Actually, probably should just leave it at one more. I had a version of this question, but I'm just going to share with you what someone in the audience asked. With all of the craziness in our lives and governments, what gives you hope?
Oh, people give me hope. People give me hope, really. Everybody out there is doing something heroic and miraculous just to get through the week in this pandemic. Like, we're all putting on a brave face and dealing with our kids, staring at a screen, trying to get educated, or, your cousin went broke, or you lost your job. I mean, everybody's just going through it right now. And the fact that, that everybody is resilient enough to sort of wake up the next morning and try again. And the fact that, this won't last forever does give me hope. The other thing I'll offer is, hope is a muscle. Hope is a decision, right? To not let despair win. And so part of the way I operate is hope is not like I'm watching a movie and I feel inspired and therefore I'm ready to charge up the mountain. Hope is you wake up every morning and you decide that you have to be hopeful, that people are relying on you, and that things do get better, and that whatever we're going through right now, that whether it's the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or the Civil War or World War II, that other Americans have gone through tougher stuff and put themselves in physical and economic and professional danger. And so now our generation has to come through this. Not that it's easy, not that it's guaranteed, but that this is just what we're supposed to do, and this is our challenge. So I want to thank you for having me. And I also want to thank all the smart people asking challenging questions. I'm sure I didn't look in the chat at who was asking the questions, but I have a feeling that they're old friends and colleagues asking some of the toughest ones. So I just want to say thanks to everybody.
Yeah, and likewise, I'm sorry that we haven't had an opportunity to get to everybody's questions. But this was wonderful. Senator Schatz, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us and to share your hope with us, especially, and your insights as well. Just really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right. Aloha. Thanks, everyone.